Picture this. Rome, the mighty empire that conquered the known world, brought to its knees not by barbarian armies or natural disasters, but by one man's insatiable appetite for cruelty and excess. This is the story of how Emperor Nero's reign of terror didn't just shock the ancient world. It fundamentally broke something inside the Roman Empire that would never fully heal. When Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus took the throne in 54 AD at just 16 years old, few could have predicted that this teenager would become one of history's most notorious tyrants. The fifth Roman emperor and the last of the prestigious Julio-Claudian dynasty, Nero initially showed promise. His early reign, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the praetorian prefect Burrus, implemented reforms to help the poor and restructure taxation. But beneath this veneer of competent leadership, something dark was already stirring. The first crack in Nero's facade appeared in his relationship with his domineering mother, Agrippina the Younger. She had orchestrated his rise to power, eliminating rivals and positioning her son for imperial succession. But Agrippina made a fatal miscalculation. She believed she could continue to rule through her teenage son indefinitely. As Nero matured, he grew increasingly resentful of her control, and this resentment would soon manifest in ways that would horrify even the violence-hardened Romans. What makes Nero's story particularly chilling isn't just the individual acts of cruelty he committed, though those were certainly horrific enough. It's how systematically he dismantled the delicate balance of power, tradition, and respect that held the vast Roman Empire together. Every decision he made seemed calculated to alienate another crucial segment of Roman society, from the Senate to the aristocracy, from the military to the common people who initially supported him. The transformation of the promising young emperor into a monster didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual descent that began with small acts of defiance against traditional Roman values and escalated into a reign of terror that would make his name synonymous with tyranny for over 2,000 years. But here's what's truly fascinating and terrifying about Nero's story. His cruelty wasn't random or impulsive. It was often calculated, designed to send messages and eliminate threats to his absolute power. By 59 AD, just 5 years into his reign, Nero had already crossed a line that even the morally flexible Roman elite found unforgivable. The murder of his own mother wasn't just an act of personal cruelty. It was a declaration that no Roman institution, no family bond, no traditional restraint would limit his power. When a Roman emperor was willing to kill the woman who gave him life and put him on the throne, what wouldn't he do to anyone else who stood in his way? This act of matricide sent shockwaves through Roman society, but it was only the beginning. Nero's paranoia and cruelty would soon extend to his wives, his advisors, his perceived political rivals, and eventually to entire groups of people he deemed convenient scapegoats for his failures. The young man who had once been praised for his potential was transforming into something that even the violence-accustomed Romans found monstrous. But Nero's impact on Rome's future went far beyond individual murders, however shocking. His financial recklessness and grandiose building projects drained the imperial treasury and forced him to implement increasingly desperate measures to fund his extravagance. The debasement of Roman currency, the crushing taxation of the provinces, and the appropriation of private wealth to fund his megalomaniacal projects created economic instability that rippled throughout the empire. Perhaps most dangerously, Nero's contempt for the Roman Senate and traditional aristocracy undermined the very foundations of Roman governance. The Senate, while not democratically elected in the modern sense, represented centuries of accumulated political wisdom and provided crucial checks on imperial power. By governing through personal decree and treating senators with open disdain, Nero destroyed the collaborative relationship between emperor and senate that had made the early empire so successful. The Great Fire of the Rome in 64 AD became the perfect symbol of Nero's destructive impact on the empire. While modern historians debate whether he actually started the fire or simply failed to prevent it, what's undeniable is how he exploited the disaster for his own ends. The massive clearing of prime Roman real estate allowed him to build his fantastical Golden House, a sprawling palace complex that consumed resources desperately needed for the city's reconstruction. Even more chilling was how Nero deflected blame for the fire onto Rome's small Christian community, launching the first systematic state persecution of Christians in Roman history. The horrific spectacles he created, turning human suffering into entertainment as Christians were torn apart by wild animals, crucified or burned alive as human torches to light his garden parties, revealed a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even Romans accustomed to gladiatorial violence. These weren't the desperate acts of a weak ruler trying to maintain power. They were the calculated decisions of someone who had convinced himself that he was above all human law and moral restraint. Nero genuinely believed that his artistic genius and divine status justified any act of cruelty necessary to maintain his position and fund his grandiose visions. The psychological impact of Nero's reign on Roman society cannot be overstated. For generations, Romans had taken pride in their republic's transformation into a stable empire under Augustus and his successors. The idea that the emperor, while possessing ultimate power, would exercise it with some degree of restraint and respect for Roman tradition was fundamental to the system's legitimacy. Nero shattered this assumption completely. His reign demonstrated that the imperial system had no effective safeguards against a truly determined tyrant. The realization that one man could hold absolute power over the known world and use it purely for personal gratification and cruel entertainment created a crisis of confidence that would plague future emperors and contribute to the increasing instability of later periods. The Pisonian conspiracy of 65 AD revealed just how thoroughly Nero had alienated Rome's elite. When prominent senators, wealthy equestrians, and even members of his own Praetorian Guard were willing to risk everything in a plot to assassinate him, it showed that his cruelty had made his rule unsustainable. The conspiracy's brutal suppression, including the forced suicide of his former tutor Seneca and dozens of other prominent Romans, only made the situation worse. By ordering the deaths of respected figures like the Stoic philosopher Thrasea, who had dared to walk out of the Senate rather than congratulate Nero on his mother's murder, the emperor was essentially declaring war on the intellectual and moral leadership of Roman society. These weren't just political executions, they were attacks on the very idea that Romans should have principles that transcended personal loyalty to the emperor. The economic consequences of Nero's reign were equally devastating and far more long-lasting than his individual acts of cruelty. His decision to reduce the silver content of Roman coins by 7% might seem like a minor technical adjustment, but it represented a fundamental breach of trust between the imperial government and its citizens. For centuries, Roman currency had been reliable, its value backed by precious metal content that people could trust. When Nero debased the currency to fund his building projects and lavish entertainments, he was essentially stealing from every person in the empire who held Roman coins. This erosion of monetary confidence would become a recurring problem in later imperial history, contributing to the economic instability that plagued the empire in subsequent centuries. The costs of Nero's megalomania extended far beyond Rome itself. His building projects required materials, craftsmen, and laborers from across the empire, disrupting local economies and creating resentment in the provinces. The crushing taxation needed to fund his extravagance fell heavily on provincial cities and wealthy individuals, many of whom began to question whether Roman rule was worth the price they were being forced to pay. Meanwhile, Nero's neglect of actual governance created problems that would outlast his reign by decades. His poor administration of Judea contributed directly to the outbreak of the First Jewish-Roman War in 66 AD, a costly and brutal conflict that drained imperial resources and created lasting instability in one of the empire's most strategically important regions. The uprising led by Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul in 68 AD wasn't just a provincial rebellion. It was a direct response to Nero's financial exploitation and administrative incompetence. When provincial governors who had served Rome loyally for decades decided that the emperor himself had become the empire's greatest threat, it revealed how completely Nero had lost the confidence of the people responsible for actually running the vast Roman territories. The rapid collapse of support for Nero in his final months demonstrated just how isolated his cruelty and excess had made him. When the Senate declared him a public enemy and the Praetorian Guard abandoned him, he found himself with virtually no supporters except a handful of personal servants. For an emperor who had controlled the largest empire in the ancient world, his pathetic end, hiding in a freedman's villa and ultimately taking his own life, was almost anticlimactic. But Nero's death in 68 AD, far from solving Rome's problems, actually made them worse. His suicide triggered the Year of the Four Emperors, a period of devastating civil war that saw 4 different men claim the imperial throne within 12 months. The rapid succession of Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian wasn't just a political crisis. It was a fundamental breakdown of the imperial system that had provided stability for over a century. The civil wars that followed Nero's death established a dangerous precedent that would haunt the Roman Empire for centuries. The realization that military commanders could march on Rome and claim the throne by force, that the army could make and unmake emperors, fundamentally altered the nature of imperial power. Future emperors would spend increasing amounts of time and resources securing military loyalty, often at the expense of effective governance. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, Nero's reign had destroyed the moral authority of the imperial office itself. Future emperors would struggle to command the automatic respect and obedience that earlier rulers had enjoyed. The memory of what one cruel emperor could do with unlimited power made Romans more suspicious of imperial authority and less willing to grant their rulers the benefit of the doubt. The social fabric of Roman society had been torn by Nero's systematic elimination of respected leaders and his attacks on traditional values. The forced suicides of prominent senators, philosophers, and military commanders had decapitated much of Rome's intellectual and moral leadership. The survivors were left traumatized and wary, less willing to speak truth to power or provide the kind of honest counsel that effective governance requires. Even the popular entertainments that had initially made Nero beloved by Rome's lower classes ultimately backfired. His appearances as an actor, musician, and charioteer, while crowd-pleasing, had degraded the dignity of imperial office in ways that would take generations to repair. Romans had grown accustomed to seeing their emperor perform like a common entertainer, making it harder for future rulers to command the awe and respect that effective leadership required. The persecution of Christians under Nero, while initially popular with many Romans who viewed the new religion with suspicion, established a pattern of scapegoating that would prove politically tempting but ultimately destructive. By demonstrating that unpopular minorities could be blamed for natural disasters and government failures, Nero created a template that future troubled emperors would follow, leading to recurring periods of persecution and social instability. Perhaps most importantly, Nero's reign had revealed the fundamental weakness of the imperial system itself. The Roman Empire had grown too large and complex to be effectively governed by any single individual. Yet the imperial system concentrated ultimate authority in one person's hands. When that person was competent and restrained, the system could work brilliantly. But when that person was cruel, incompetent, or mad, there were no effective checks on their power. The constitutional crisis created by Nero's reign would never be fully resolved. Future emperors would face the same basic dilemma: how to exercise the absolute power necessary to govern a vast empire while maintaining enough restraint and respect for tradition to preserve their legitimacy. Many would fail to strike this balance, leading to recurring periods of instability and civil war. The economic precedents set by Nero's reign were equally destructive and long-lasting. His willingness to debase the currency, confiscate private property, and impose crushing taxation to fund personal projects established patterns that future financially pressed emperors would follow. The gradual erosion of Roman monetary stability and the increasing burden of taxation would contribute significantly to the empire's eventual decline. The military consequences of Nero's reign were perhaps most immediately visible, but also most enduring. The Year of the Four Emperors had demonstrated that imperial succession could not be taken for granted, that military strength was ultimately more important than legal legitimacy or senatorial approval. The immediate consequences of Nero's death reverberated throughout the Roman world, like shock waves from a massive earthquake. When news reached the distant provinces that the emperor had taken his own life in that suburban villa, the reaction wasn't relief or celebration. It was pure chaos. Within hours, different military commanders across the empire began eyeing the vacant throne, each convinced they possessed the legitimacy and strength to claim ultimate power. This wasn't just political ambition. This was the Roman Empire's first real test of whether it could survive without the stabilizing presence of a single, undisputed ruler. The year of the 4 emperors that followed Nero's suicide exposed every structural weakness in the Roman political system. Galba, the elderly governor of Hispania, who had initially rebelled against Nero, marched on Rome with the backing of his legions. His reign lasted a mere 7 months before his own Praetorian Guard turned against him, literally hacking him to pieces in the Roman Forum. Otho, who had orchestrated Galba's assassination, held power for just 3 months before facing Vitellius, whose German legions proved superior in battle. Otho's response was suicide. Vitellius managed to cling to power for 8 months before Vespasian's forces stormed Rome, ending the civil war but leaving the empire fundamentally changed. This rapid succession of emperors revealed a terrifying truth about Roman governance. The empire's stability depended entirely on the military's loyalty, and that loyalty could be bought, manipulated, or simply transferred to whoever promised the largest donative. The Praetorian Guard, originally established to protect the emperor, had become kingmakers willing to murder their own commanders for the right price. Provincial armies discovered they could march on Rome and install their own candidates. The Senate, once the supreme governing body of the Republic, was reduced to a ceremonial role, desperately trying to legitimize whoever currently held the most swords. The economic devastation during this period was staggering. Each new emperor needed to buy loyalty from the legions, the Praetorian Guard, and the Roman populace. These massive expenditures, combined with the costs of constant warfare, drained the imperial treasury that Nero had already severely depleted. Vespasian, when he finally stabilized the situation, inherited an empire on the brink of bankruptcy. The financial strain was so severe that he was forced to implement harsh new taxes, including the infamous tax on public urinals that prompted his cynical observation that money has no odor. The social trauma of the Civil War period cannot be understated. Roman citizens witnessed their capital city besieged multiple times within a single year. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, the most sacred site in Rome, was burned during street fighting between rival factions. Citizens who had supported the wrong emperor faced execution or exile when power changed hands. The psychological impact of seeing the empire's most powerful institutions collapse so quickly shattered the confidence that had sustained Roman society for centuries. Nero's persecution of Christians, while initially appearing to be a minor footnote in his reign, had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond his death. The precedent he established of using religious minorities as scapegoats for imperial failures became a recurring theme in Roman history. Future emperors, facing their own crises, would repeatedly turn to Christian persecution as a way to deflect blame and unite the population against a common enemy. The great persecutions under Decius, Valerian, and Diocletian all followed the blueprint Nero had established, creating cycles of violence that weakened social cohesion and alienated significant portions of the population. The economic policies Nero implemented in his desperation to fund his projects created lasting damage to Roman monetary stability. His debasement of the currency wasn't just a temporary measure, but the beginning of a long-term trend that would plague the empire for centuries. Subsequent emperors, facing their own financial crises, found it increasingly tempting to reduce the silver content of coins rather than implement unpopular tax increases or spending cuts. By the 3rd century, the Roman denarius contained so little silver that it was essentially worthless, contributing to the empire-wide inflation and economic collapse known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. The military consequences of Nero's reign were equally profound. His paranoid purges of competent generals and administrators left the empire dangerously short of experienced leadership. The rebellion of Vindex in Gaul succeeded not because of Vindex's military genius, but because Nero had systematically eliminated or alienated the very people who might have effectively suppressed it. When the civil war erupted, the empire lacked the institutional knowledge and leadership continuity that had previously enabled it to weather political crises. The psychological impact on the Roman elite was transformative. Senators and aristocrats who had survived Nero's reign emerged traumatized and fundamentally changed in their relationship with imperial power. The old ideal of the Principate, where the emperor was theoretically first among equals, was revealed as a dangerous fiction. Future emperors would never again be able to rely on the traditional deference of the senatorial class. Instead, they would need to rule through fear, bribery, or carefully managed compromise, creating a more brittle and unstable political system. The provincial impact of Nero's misrule extended far beyond Rome itself. The First Jewish-Roman War, which began in the final years of Nero's reign, was directly attributable to his administration's incompetence and corruption in Judea. The conflict, which would rage for 7 years and result in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple, represented a catastrophic failure of Roman governance. The war's enormous cost in blood and treasure, combined with the permanent alienation of the Jewish population, created a festering wound in the empire's eastern provinces that would never fully heal. The cultural and artistic legacy of Nero's reign also contributed to Rome's long-term decline. While his patronage of the arts might seem positive, his personal involvement in public performances as an actor and musician fundamentally degraded the dignity of the imperial office. Future emperors would struggle to maintain the gravitas and respect that effective leadership required. The image of the emperor as a divine or semi-divine figure, essential for maintaining loyalty across the vast empire, was permanently tarnished by Nero's theatrical antics and public spectacles. The administrative precedents Nero established proved equally damaging. His reliance on freedmen and personal favorites rather than traditional aristocratic administrators created a more arbitrary and less competent bureaucracy. This pattern of governance by personal whim rather than institutional procedure would be repeated by future emperors, gradually eroding the professional competence of Roman administration. The empire's ability to effectively govern its vast territories depended on maintaining consistent, predictable policies implemented by skilled administrators. Nero's example encouraged a more personalized, chaotic approach to governance that ultimately proved unsustainable. The religious implications of Nero's reign extended beyond his persecution of Christians to encompass his broader relationship with traditional Roman religion. His construction of the Domus Aurea required the demolition of numerous temples and sacred sites, actions that deeply offended traditional Roman religious sensibilities. His apparent belief in his own divinity and his demand for divine honors while still alive violated fundamental Roman concepts about the relationship between mortals and gods. These religious transgressions created lasting resentment among the Roman people and undermined the spiritual foundations of imperial authority. The military lessons learned from Nero's downfall fundamentally changed the nature of Roman imperial succession. The Flavian dynasty that emerged from the Civil War was acutely aware that their legitimacy depended entirely on military support. This realization led to a more militarized approach to imperial governance, with emperors spending increasing amounts of time with their armies and greater resources devoted to military expenses. While this approach provided short-term stability, it ultimately contributed to the empire's fiscal problems and the growing political influence of the military at the expense of civilian institutions. The international consequences of Nero's reign were equally significant. Rome's enemies and rivals observed the empire's internal chaos with great interest, recognizing that the seemingly invincible Roman military machine was vulnerable to internal political instability. The Parthian Empire, Rome's primary eastern rival, began to adopt a more aggressive posture, sensing weakness in Roman resolve. Germanic tribes along the northern frontier similarly became more bold in their raids and territorial encroachments. the image of Roman invincibility, so crucial to maintaining the empire's vast frontiers with relatively small military forces, was permanently damaged. The long-term demographic impact of Nero's policies also contributed to Rome's eventual decline. His brutal suppression of the Pisonian conspiracy and subsequent paranoid purges eliminated many of the empire's most capable leaders and administrators. The loss of this human capital, combined with the climate of fear that discouraged political participation among the surviving elite, created a leadership vacuum that would plague the empire for generations. The Roman system depended on attracting talented individuals to public service, but Nero's example demonstrated that such service could easily result in death or exile. The cumulative effect of these various factors created a Roman Empire that was fundamentally weaker and less stable than the one Nero had inherited. While the empire would continue to exist for several more centuries, and would even experience periods of recovery and expansion, it never again achieved the confidence, stability, and seemingly effortless dominance that had characterized the early imperial period. Nero's legacy stands as a chilling reminder of how unchecked power and systematic cruelty can unravel even the mightiest of civilizations. His reign didn't just end with his suicide in 68 AD. It triggered a cascade of consequences that would haunt Rome for generations. The Year of the Four Emperors revealed the empire's dangerous dependence on military loyalty over legitimate governance, establishing a precedent where armies could make and break emperors at will. The financial devastation Nero inflicted through currency debasement and reckless spending created lasting economic instability that future emperors would struggle to repair. His persecution of Christians set a template for religious oppression that would periodically resurface, while his destruction of senatorial authority permanently weakened Rome's traditional governing institutions. The fear and paranoia he cultivated infected Roman political culture, making conspiracy and violence routine tools of imperial politics. Perhaps most significantly, Nero demonstrated that Rome's greatest threat wasn't external enemies, but the monsters it could create from within. His transformation from promising young ruler to tyrannical despot showed how absolute power could corrupt absolutely, turning the empire's strength into its weakness. The stability Augustus had so carefully constructed crumbled under Nero's cruelty, revealing that Rome's golden age could end not with foreign conquest, but through the actions of a single cruel emperor who prioritized personal gratification over imperial responsibility. Nero's reign marked the moment Rome began eating itself from the inside out.